Loving and gracious God, may the words of my mouth and meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, Almighty God, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. You know, it was a cold January night. We arrived at the hospital at about 11:30 or so. I don't remember the exact time, but what I do remember was sitting at the desk of the person admitting Anna to the hospital. And I remember looking over my left shoulder just in time to see the clock strike midnight. January 23rd. My child's birthday would be January 23rd. That's what went through my mind. In truth, it would be precisely 1 hour and 9 minutes from that very moment that everything in our lives would change. You know, there's a running joke. Well, all right, it's not really a joke. It's actually true. When our daughter was born, I got her gender wrong. She came out and her umbilical cord was wrapped around her leg in a very strategic way so that I saw something that wasn't there, and my first words as a parent were, "It's a boy." It was a girl. Hey, you know, every parent makes mistakes. They usually just don't happen literally in the very first second of being a parent, but every parent makes mistakes. And it wouldn't be long that we came to realize that the challenges that we would face as parents would always be present in some form or another. I so remember on that very first night all those years ago when we came home from the hospital with our newborn, correctly identified daughter, and we had this sudden realization that there were no nurses present, there was no coach, there were no books, there was no internet at the time. There was nothing that could tell us what we were doing right or what we were doing wrong, or more importantly, why she was crying at that particular moment. The contextualization of our challenges as parents is actually pretty universal. It's easy to illustrate how we as a couple faced the things that we went through. But the other part of it, the deeper part of it, is the paradoxical truth that many of the challenges that we went through were not at all misaligned with the challenges that our parents went through. Oh, sure, our parents never needed to negotiate the world of cell phones like we did, or figure out how or when or even why to allow access to the internet like we did. But embedded with the universal truth of parenthood is the ever-changing landscape of life that fits within the context of the more things change, the more they stay the same. Every parent that has raised their children to go out into the world has faced those same challenges of teaching our children to navigate in the world and to face the obstacles as best we can. Our reading in Matthew 10 gives us a very pointed lesson that Jesus is passing on to his disciples. In the previous chapter and into the beginning of this one, Jesus is sending his disciples out into the world, telling them to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, proclaiming the good news, the kingdom of heaven has come near. He's telling them to heal the sick, to cast out demons, to gather the lost sheep. And he even says in verse 16, "I am sending you out like sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." And this is what leads us into verse 24, in which our reading breaks into 4 distinct sections. First, there is the close connection drawn between the disciple and the teacher, the slave and the master. Disciples are not greater than their teacher, and slaves are not greater than their master. These words on the surface may seem to be almost dismissive of the disciples. But taken in context of the previous chapter and a half, we find out that Jesus is actually cautioning his disciples that as they are going out into the world to do the mission work he's giving them, they should not expect any better reception than he himself has received. As if to say, friends, don't get your hopes up. And you know, that's very important because it then carries us into the second section in which Jesus says not once, not twice, but 3 times, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid of those people, because nothing is hidden that won't be revealed, and nothing secret that won't be brought out into the open. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body but can't kill the soul. Do not be afraid, because aren't 2 sparrows sold for a small coin? But not one of them will fall to the ground without your Father knowing about it already. You are worth more than many sparrows. Do not be afraid. And it is here in verses 32 and 33 that Jesus then gives the reminder of how we behave, how we act out there in the world ultimately matters. Therefore, everyone who acknowledges me before people, I will also acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. But everyone who denies me before people, I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven. There is no evading responsibility or claiming exemption because we were uncertain about anything. Matthew's gospel is practically from beginning to end a very long commentary on what it means to acknowledge and deny Jesus. From the opening chapters in which Jesus calls his disciples until the very end at the Great Commission, this gospel confronts readers with characters who either say yes or no, those who demonstrate faithfulness or unfaithfulness. And Jesus, like a parent teaching his children how to go out into the world, is very clear about the many dangers, toils, and snares, to use a phrase, that they will face, because as this reading moves into the 4th section, Jesus pulls no punches in reminding them that his message of love and freedom is so radical that it literally challenges the structures and arrangements of the old order. The way we've always done things. He uses that famous parable in chapter 9 that the old wineskins cannot contain the dynamic of the new wine. Well, the result is, as he references in chapter 10, the sword. The result is conflict with those who are desperately trying to hold on to the old, the former ways, the ways that they were comfortable with. He is teaching them that remaining beholden to the old ways, the old order, will ultimately result in conflict, division, and pain. And that explains why Jesus quotes the prophet Micah when he says, I've come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. People's enemies are members of their own households. Beloved children of God, Jesus is not trying to scare his disciples, and he's certainly not trying to tell them that if they just be good little disciples, they can avoid conflict. Quite the opposite, in fact. He's trying to prepare them for the challenging terrain that is ahead of them. Have you ever experienced one of those parents that defended their children's actions no matter what it was? The child had a failing grade in school. It must be the teacher's fault. The child got into a fight. It must have been the other kid's fault. The child broke something in someone else's yard or in someone else's house, and it was the neighbor's fault for putting that thing in the child's way. As if the parents were raising their children to think that no matter what, the world owes them. We taught our daughters that there were consequences to their actions, that they needed to be accountable for what they do and what they do not do. And if we hadn't set their expectations for how to live as responsible adults, then we would have ourselves been irresponsible as parents. Likewise, we have to wonder how well Jesus would have been preparing his disciples if he hadn't set their expectations at a reasonable and responsible level to know what awaited them after the Great Commission. He isn't saying that the sticking together of families necessarily reflects faithfulness, or that by family solidarity, society's ills will be remedied by their work. Instead, he's calling into question the idolatry of the family, the clinging to the old and the obsolete ways, and he warns that the gospel may ultimately divide rather than unite the home. And that sharp either or of verses 37 and 38 is supported by the paradox in verse 39, the losing of life for the sake of Christ. And in the context of the Gospel of Matthew, the including of the vulnerability of potential martyrdom is how life is experienced and truly discovered. We are at a crossroads in our world. And as we continue to see old ways being called into account, we, my friends, are at a crossroad. On the one front, our fundamental understanding of how we interact with each other is being called into question as we begin to consider how we do our shopping, how we do our banking, how we go to restaurants, or even how we will reopen our church buildings. The use of technology for our worship had never even been seriously considered within these churches until all of a sudden they needed to be. And in the past, any efforts that these congregations have made to get food to people unable to make ends meet has been minimal at best because it wasn't needed. But today, it's a major concern. And then on another front, we have the issue of systemic racism being made front and center in all of our lives. Please understand that I'm talking about systemic racism. This is not the racist remarks or actions of one person or a small group of people. I'm not trying to draw comparisons between people who are good at being fair to all people regardless of race and people whose actions are a stain upon our culture. I'm talking about systemic racism. I'm talking about the way our culture is built and has lived for over 400 years that oppresses people with brown skin in ways that people with white skin can never understand. The whole point of the protests that we've seen over these past weeks has really very little to do with the relatively small handful of people in authority whose actions have been caught on video. And they have everything to do with the systems in place that allow these things to happen in the first place. And as people of Christ's way, it is those very old ways, those very old systems that are in place that we are called to rise up and challenge, potentially turning one against the other, being met with resistance from those who would protect those systems as the way we've always done things. And let's be very clear here. The church itself is not immune to this call from Jesus either. Listen to the cries that we've heard in the church, not just recently, but for decades, over the issue of full inclusion for LGBTQ brothers and sisters. It's no different than when women fought for the right to be ordained, or in the 18th, 19th, and even 20th centuries when our church buildings were segregated. We are always called to break ourselves away from the old ways of exclusion, the structures of separateness. And we are called to bring ourselves deeper into the realm of radical welcoming of all people. And we are called to a level of hospitality that leaves no doubt as to how Christ would have us share God's love. In the second book of Peter, he writes, "The Lord is not slow about his promise, as some think of slowness, but is patient with you, not wanting any to perish, but all to come to repentance." In sending his disciples out into the world, Jesus is very bluntly telling them that as they go out, their silence is not an option for the sake of keeping peace. As parents, we engage in this long exercise that starts from the moment they're born to build within our children the ability to grow beyond us, continuing the work to make the world a better place for all people, that their children and their children's children may also come into the struggle, bringing the love of God into a world that pushes back against it. And for us, that means that our work as disciples of Jesus Christ is not done yet. Even today, in the midst of everything going on in the world, we can and we must be the voice of Christ, welcoming the stranger, the gentleness of Christ, healing the sick, and the warm embrace of loving the unloved. Will we make mistakes along the way? Count on it. Will God be glorified in the process? Absolutely. But we can't be afraid of the challenges that await us as a church, as Christ's disciples. In fact, the only thing that we should be afraid of is our silence. To God be the glory.